A racist hiring manager blatantly rejected a black candidate, claiming he was not a good fit for the company's culture. But when the candidate's true identity was revealed, she was left speechless, and the unjust hiring system she represented began to crumble. This candidate's journey is not just a tale of justice, but a profound lesson in accountability and change. Don't forget to hit subscribe to follow more shocking and meaningful stories. David Miller, a powerful black CEO of Horizon Edge Corporation, decided to challenge his system by disguising himself as a job applicant. For a long time, he had heard whispered complaints from employees about unfair recruitment practices, hints of bias and prejudice. Not wanting to rely on reports or hearsay, David chose to confront reality head-on by becoming a part of the system he led. With a bold plan, he disguised himself as an ordinary applicant, armed with a resume that far exceeded the requirements for the position he was applying for. It was a Monday morning at Horizon Edge's headquarters in the heart of New York City. The sky was clear, and the bustling energy inside the sleek high-rise building, with its gleaming glass walls reflecting the sunlight, was palpable. David sat in the waiting area, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase filled with an impressive dossier of his career achievements. Although he appeared calm and confident on the outside, inside he wrestled with a storm of thoughts. Could the suspicions of discrimination within his company be true? The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 a.m., signaling the time for his interview. David looked up as a woman dressed in a polished business suit entered the waiting area with a clipboard in hand. On the clipboard, the name was visible: Megan Carter, Head of Human Resources. With a professional yet slightly strained smile, Megan glanced at David and said, "Mr. David Miller, correct? Please follow me." David rose, mentally preparing himself for an interview that was not merely about a job, but a test of Horizon Edge's core values. As he followed Megan, he reminded himself that it was time for the truth to come to light. David followed Megan Carter into the interview room, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished wooden floor, a subtle reminder of the room's solemn atmosphere. The space was elegantly furnished, with a gleaming wooden desk, luxurious leather chairs, and a large window offering a sweeping view of New York City glittering in the afternoon sun. Megan, dressed sharply in a gray suit, sat upright, like a symbol of authority. Her professionalism radiated from every gesture, but her sharp, calculating gaze carried a sternness that made it hard for anyone across from her to feel at ease. Just minutes earlier, in a corner of the outer office, Megan had been conversing with a colleague. Her voice carried just enough volume to ensure her words left no room for misunderstanding. "I've always believed that candidates from regions not known for their professionalism rarely meet our standards," she emphasized, her eyes glinting with an unspoken understanding. "The company needs people who aren't just talented, but who perfectly embody our image." Her words weren't merely offhand remarks, they were laden with bias, creating an invisible wall David would have to scale even before the interview began. Back in the interview room, Megan tilted her head slightly, a polite smile gracing her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. Her every glance seemed to weigh David, as if assessing whether he deserved entry into the world she considered the pinnacle of excellence. "Mr. Miller, please have a seat," she said, her tone coolly courteous, masked in a veneer of professionalism. David stepped forward and settled into the chair across from her with an air of confidence that wasn't overbearing. He responded with a warm smile, attempting to ease the tension that hung in the room. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I've been looking forward to discussing this opportunity," he said, his voice steady and sincere. Even so, David couldn't ignore the way Megan placed her notepad on the table, spinning her pen subtly, a quiet assertion of control. Her eyes skimmed over his resume with meticulous focus, offering no visible reaction to the accomplishments he had worked so hard to achieve. A fleeting glance betrayed her skepticism, and when she spoke, her words were carefully measured. "You seem to have quite a bit of experience," she said, but the slight drawl at the end of her statement rendered the compliment hollow, more of a test than a recognition. David didn't flinch. Maintaining his calm demeanor, he met Megan's gaze and responded confidently. "Yes, I've been fortunate to lead several major projects and work with diverse teams. That's given me the ability to learn and adapt to a wide range of environments." Megan nodded, though she refrained from replying immediately. The deliberate pause she left hanging seemed designed to heighten the pressure. Her gaze returned to the resume, skimming through its details again before she finally lowered her voice. "We'll delve deeper into the specifics during the interview, but first, do you have any questions?" David hesitated briefly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Megan. He recognized that her doubt wasn't merely about his experience or abilities. There was something deeper, a barrier rooted in the prejudices she had unwittingly revealed in her earlier conversation. Those words still echoed in his mind, reminding him that this was more than just an interview. It was a battle. At that moment, David realized that to overcome this barrier, he would need to do more than prove his qualifications. He would have to dismantle the deeply ingrained biases Megan had constructed. The battle had begun, and he was ready to face it, one step at a time. David adjusted his posture, leaning slightly forward to convey focus, even though he was fully aware that the atmosphere in the room was more than just serious. Megan began the interview with standard questions about his background and experience, but her voice carried a cold precision as if she was searching for reasons to counter rather than genuinely listening. With each question, David answered confidently, his tone clear and decisive. He recounted his career journey, from restructuring companies teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and guiding them back to success, to leading multi-million-dollar projects with professionalism and dedication. Megan nodded, her eyes fixed on the resume in front of her, her pen occasionally emphasizing a few points. Yet her expression betrayed no impression of being impressed. Instead, she lifted her head, her sharp gaze piercing and tinged with skepticism, casting a shadow over the room. "Very impressive, Mr. Miller," Megan said, her lips curling into a fleeting smile that failed to reach her eyes. "But I have to wonder, with such experience, do you think you'd be a good fit for our high-profile clientele?" David detected the subtle undertone in her question. Megan's tone sounded ordinary, but the implications were laden with innuendo. The question wasn't simply about competence, it was about him as a person. She was implicitly questioning whether he, with his skin color, background, or appearance, could meet the rigorous standards this company demanded for its elite clientele. Keeping his voice steady, David offered a polite smile, his eyes reflecting calm resolve. "I believe professionalism and results are always valued above any other factor. Throughout my career, I've worked with major corporations and earned the trust of even the most demanding clients. I'm confident that the values I bring align with any environment." Megan didn't respond immediately. She tilted her head slightly, as though pondering, her eyes scrutinizing David as if weighing every word he had just spoken. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the light tapping of her pen on the desk. After a few moments, she continued, her tone gentle but still laced with a challenging undertone. "You seem very confident, but I'm not sure if your style would truly mesh with our team. We're a dynamic, competitive group that requires a high level of cohesion." David understood instantly. Her emphasis on the word mesh was no accident. It was a subtle insinuation, a reminder that he was different, and perhaps in Megan's mind, that difference was a barrier. He maintained his smile, but his voice gained an edge of firmness. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working in highly diverse environments. I've always believed that true cohesion doesn't come from similarity but from how we combine strengths and differing perspectives to achieve shared success. That's what I bring to any team I'm part of." Megan's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile before she quickly jotted down a few notes. She moved on to another question, but the sharpness in her tone persisted. "What would you do if faced with a difficult situation without support from your team? We need individuals who can stand firm without relying on others." David, maintaining his composed demeanor, detailed several challenging situations he had encountered. He described how he led teams through crises, and how he solved problems independently when no one else had solutions. Yet even as he spoke, Megan's gaze remained probing. Every answer seemed to be filtered through a lens of bias, a skepticism that David could sense. As the interview progressed, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly stifling. David, accustomed to the pressure of high-stakes situations in his career, couldn't help but notice the heavy weight of Megan's demeanor. She wasn't merely assessing his qualifications. It felt as though she had already decided he wasn't a fit, no matter how well he answered. Still, David refused to let himself falter. Every word he spoke was deliberate, every answer filled with confidence. He understood that what he faced wasn't just an interview, it was a battle to dismantle invisible barriers, to challenge the biases Megan tried to veil beneath her professional exterior. He knew he had to prove himself not only as a candidate, but also against a deeper challenge, reshaping the perceptions that Megan and others like her had long imposed. Despite the oppressive pressure, David resolved that he wouldn't back down. He knew his worth and believed that with perseverance and talent, he could overcome any prejudice. This battle, though tense, was only just beginning. The interview lasted longer than necessary, not because of its content, but due to the heavy atmosphere that weighed down every question and response. Megan slowly closed her notebook, each deliberate motion underscoring her control over the situation. When she finally looked up, her gaze had shed any pretense of politeness, replaced with a cold, evaluative stare that made it clear this conversation had gone on longer than she had wanted. "Thank you for your time today, Mr. Miller," Megan said, her tone purely formal, devoid of sincerity. "However, after careful consideration, I don't believe you're a fit for Horizon Edge's culture." David maintained his calm expression, his shoulders straight, though inside he felt the true meaning behind her words. This wasn't about his qualifications or experience, both of which he had demonstrated exceptionally. Megan's statement carried something deeper, more unsettling, a prejudice that didn't need to be stated outright to be unmistakable. Megan seemed to sense David's gaze, but she didn't waver. Instead, she continued with a calculated emphasis in her words. "We're looking for candidates who can make a strong impression from the very first moment. Unfortunately, I don't think this position is the best fit for you." The faint smile that crossed Megan's lips was an unmistakable rejection. It wasn't apologetic or empathetic, but coldly dismissive, a mask for the biases she chose not to voice directly. The already tense atmosphere in the room seemed to crystallize, leaving only a chilling silence between two opposing forces. David didn't flinch. He returned her smile with a faint one of his own, not one of concession, but of quiet defiance, a statement that her words hadn't defeated him. His voice was steady, polite, and free of any hint of anger or hurt. "Thank you for your time, Miss Carter. I appreciate the opportunity to interview today." He rose, adjusting his suit jacket with calm precision, each movement radiating confidence. As he walked toward the door, his eyes remained bright, a silent declaration that this story wasn't over. David stepped out into the hallway, the long corridor stretching before him in an eerie quiet. Behind him, Megan remained seated at her desk, watching him for a moment. But there was no regret or reconsideration in her gaze. Instead, she turned to the colleague seated beside her, a smug half-smile curling on her lips. "He seems intelligent," Megan said softly, her voice tinged with a subtle but unmistakable mockery. "But I don't think he'd blend well with our high-profile clients. We need someone who aligns with Horizon Edge's image." The words, spoken lightly, carried heavy judgment. Megan's true motivation for her decision was no longer ambiguous. It wasn't about skill or experience, but a deeply ingrained prejudice she regarded as essential to upholding the company's image. David walked slowly down the corridor, his expression composed, revealing nothing of what he felt. But instead of heading straight for the exit, he stopped, his eyes scanning the directory on the wall. His gaze flickered briefly before he turned toward a different path, the direction leading to the elevators that would take him to the top floor where the executive offices were located. As the elevator doors closed behind him, his reflection on the polished metal surface radiated determination. This wasn't a rash decision. He had prepared for this possibility. He wasn't simply confronting a failed interview, but an entire system that enabled the kind of bias Megan had displayed. When the elevator stopped and the doors slid open, David stepped out with firm, purposeful strides. He understood that this was no longer just about a job. It was a mission, an opportunity to challenge and expose the truth. Not just to confront Megan, but to address the invisible yet deeply entrenched barriers she represented. And David knew this was only the beginning. David walked down the hallway, each step steady yet laden with a storm of emotions inside. The interview room and Megan Carter's cold gaze faded into the distance, but her prejudice-laden words still echoed in his mind. He didn't head toward the usual exit. Instead, David moved to the elevator at the end of the corridor, where the polished metal doors reflected the image of a composed man harboring a monumental decision. As he pressed the elevator call button, his mind replayed the fragments of stories employees had shared with him before. "She always rejects candidates from less prestigious areas, not because they're unqualified, but because she doesn't want to see them in the company. The way she asks questions makes me feel like I don't stand a chance, even though I meet all the criteria." These complaints had once seemed to him like mere rumors, a small blemish on a system he had thought he understood well. But today's experience confirmed them. Prejudice wasn't just present. It had infiltrated deep into the system he once took pride in for being fair and transparent. This wasn't just a personal issue. It was a threat to the very values Horizon Edge sought to uphold. David took a deep breath, his gaze sharp as a freshly honed blade. In that fleeting moment, his next course of action crystallized. When the elevator doors opened with a soft ding, he stepped in and pressed the button for the top floor, where the company's executive offices were located. In the quiet of the elevator, he adjusted his tie, each gesture radiating absolute confidence. Though his heart surged with fierce determination, his exterior remained calm and composed. This wasn't just about him. It was about truth, justice, and the changes he knew he had to lead. The elevator ascended floor by floor, the display numbers changing slowly. But in David's mind, everything was calculated and clear. He wouldn't let any opportunity slip. When the elevator stopped at the top floor and the doors opened, He stepped into a space entirely different from the rest of the building. Natural light poured in through expansive glass windows, revealing a breathtaking view of New York City. Polished marble walls and lush green plants created an atmosphere that was both formal and modern. Anthony, David's assistant, spotted him immediately as he stepped out. Anthony's face briefly showed surprise at David's unannounced arrival, but he quickly regained his professional demeanor. "Mr. Miller, everything's ready in the boardroom," Anthony said, his tone light yet respectful. David nodded without a word and walked toward the meeting room. The large doors, made of dark walnut wood, opened before him, and the atmosphere inside changed instantly as he entered. The entire senior management team of Horizon Edge sat around a long conference table, their gazes shifting from the documents before them to the man who had just entered. One by one, they stood in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect befitting a CEO like David. He strode to the chair at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room before he sat down. A meaningful silence enveloped the space, signaling that everyone was anticipating something significant. David opened his briefcase, placed it neatly on the table, and slowly looked up, his eyes carrying an extraordinary gravity. "Before we discuss today's business agenda, I need to share an experience I just had," David said, his tone low yet commanding, as though each word carried the weight of the entire room. The silence deepened, and all eyes fixed on David. A few exchanged quick, curious glances, but no one dared to speak. "I just went through an interview," he continued, emphasizing each word, "with a candidate who, in my assessment, was fully qualified for the position we're looking to fill. However, I realized there are elements in our hiring process influenced by unacceptable biases. This isn't the first time I've heard about this issue, but today I saw it firsthand." David paused, his gaze sweeping across each face, from seasoned directors to newly promoted managers. They looked back at him, some sitting up straighter as though bracing for a tense discussion, others betraying faint signs of unease. Horizon Edge was built on the foundations of innovation, diversity, and fairness, David said, his voice growing stronger. "But if we allow personal biases to dictate critical decisions, we not only betray our core values but jeopardize the future of this company." At that moment, the silence stretched, laden with meaning, signaling that David's words were not just criticism, but a declaration that things would have to change. And he knew that his actions today were not merely about correcting a mistake, but about setting a new standard, one that no one could ignore. David scanned the room, his gaze sharp as a blade, slicing through the expressions of each senior executive present. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of papers from a few who pretended to be busy, masking their unease. This was not a routine meeting, and everyone could feel the weight in the air. David rose to his feet, placing both hands firmly on the table to command undivided attention. He drew a deep breath before speaking, his voice clear and authoritative. "I've just had an experience that I believe we need to discuss immediately." His words drew every eye toward him. Some looked startled, while others maintained a facade of composure that couldn't fully hide their apprehension. Among them, Michael Green, a middle-aged executive known for his close ties to Megan Carter, couldn't stay silent for long. Straightening in his seat, he raised an eyebrow and spoke. "David, I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying you went undercover as a candidate? Why? For what purpose?" David didn't allow the interruption to derail him. He nodded, his eyes locking onto Michael's, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "Yes," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "I posed as a candidate applying for a regular position at this company. I wanted to experience our hiring process firsthand, to verify the concerns I've heard from employees. Concerns that our system is rife with bias and prejudice. The tension in the room thickened. David opened his briefcase, pulling out a notebook and a thick folder. He placed them deliberately on the table, ensuring everyone understood that his claims were backed by evidence, not mere opinion. "Let me recount this morning's interview," David began, his gaze sweeping across the room to emphasize the authenticity of his story. The person interviewing me was Megan Carter. She started by evaluating my experience, but very quickly the focus shifted from qualifications to questions loaded with implicit bias. Opening the notebook, David turned to a specific page and read aloud. One of the first questions she asked was, "Do you think you can fit in with our high-profile clients?" A question entirely unrelated to the skills and experience clearly outlined in my resume. David paused, his eyes resting on Michael Green, who now looked visibly uneasy. "Michael," David asked, his tone firm, "do you believe this is a reasonable professional criterion to evaluate a candidate?" Michael hesitated, his hand brushing nervously along the edge of the table, as if searching for stability. After a few moments of silence, he finally responded, "I suppose it could be relevant to how a candidate interacts with clients." David cut him off sharply, his voice rising with force, each word landing like a hammer. "And what about this question? I'm not sure if your style will align with our team's." Phrases like fit and style. Those were her words. Let's not pretend this was about professional evaluation. This was coded language meant to imply that I, as a person of color, do not belong here. This wasn't about competence. This was discrimination. The room descended into a heavy silence. A few executives seemed poised to speak, but quickly thought better of it. Michael Green, who had initially sought to defend Megan, now sat with his head lowered, his face tense with discomfort. David continued, pulling out a thicker, meticulously organized file from his briefcase. "And this isn't just my experience. I've collected feedback from numerous employees within the company who have faced similar situations. These are clear, documented examples that this is not an isolated incident. It's a systemic problem." He handed the file to his assistant, Anthony, who distributed copies to everyone in the room. As they flipped through the pages, expressions of concern and unease became visible. Some sighed quietly. Others frowned as they read the complaints and evidence David had compiled. When the executives looked up, David stood tall, his gaze meeting theirs with unflinching resolve. "We cannot continue to tolerate behavior like this," he declared, his voice now a command. "This isn't about one individual or one interview. This is about a culture we've allowed to persist for far too long. If we don't address it, we won't just lose our core values. We'll lose the trust of our employees, our clients, and ourselves." The room seemed frozen, not out of fear, but in realization. Everyone present knew David's words could not be dismissed. They weren't facing an angry CEO. They were confronting a leader determined to overhaul a broken system. David stepped back toward his seat, his eyes never leaving the room. He understood that the path forward would be difficult, but this was just the beginning. He was ready to face every challenge to ensure Horizon Edge became a fair, inclusive workplace worthy of everyone's trust. The atmosphere in the boardroom grew heavy following David's resolute statement. A few members of the leadership team exchanged worried glances, fully aware that the situation was escalating into something serious. At that moment, the doors to the boardroom opened, and Megan Carter walked in, holding a notepad, her expression slightly puzzled. She hadn't been given an explanation when she was summoned. only that she needed to be present immediately. Megan froze upon seeing David seated at the head of the table, his commanding presence evident in his sharp gaze and confident posture. At first, she hesitated, forcing a nervous smile. But when she realized that David was the candidate she had rejected earlier that morning, the smile quickly faded. "Please, have a seat, Megan," David said, his tone calm but imbued with authority. Megan hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking support from her colleagues. But no one spoke. With a sense of unease, she took the seat directly across from David. Megan lowered her head, her hands unconsciously tightening around the pen on the table as her thoughts churned. Memories of her early career surfaced, her days as an intern at a small firm. Back then, she'd been denied opportunities for advancement for the very same reason: not a fit for the company culture. That seemingly simple phrase had haunted her, shaping her belief that everything needed to be meticulously controlled to avoid the mistakes she had witnessed. In her mind, the words of her former boss echoed, "If you want to survive, always choose the least risky candidates, even if it means overlooking some talented ones." Megan didn't think of herself as biased. She believed she was protecting the company from uncertainty. But now, under David's piercing gaze and the silence of her peers, she realized that this very mindset had turned her into the kind of person she once despised. David stared directly at Megan, his voice breaking the silence with deliberate clarity. "Miss Carter, can you explain why I wasn't a fit for the company culture?" The question jolted Megan. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. Before she could respond, a voice from the far end of the table interrupted. It was Michael Green, a senior leader known for his no-nonsense approach. Rising from his chair, he spoke with a tone brimming with challenge. "David, I think you're overcomplicating this matter. Megan was doing her job the way we expected her to. The system isn't perfect, but I don't believe it's flawed to the extent you're implying." The tension in the room became palpable. Some executives exchanged uneasy looks, clearly unwilling to take sides, but also not fully backing David. David took a deep breath, his sharp gaze locking onto Michael. "Michael," David began, his tone calm yet carrying undeniable force, "what you call an imperfect system has cost countless people opportunities they deserved. This isn't just one person's mistake. It's a systemic problem that reflects a culture we've allowed to persist." Michael raised an eyebrow, refusing to back down. "David, you're talking about a few isolated cases, but the reality is, this company is thriving. We need to think carefully before dismantling a system that's been in place for years." David's voice sharpened, his words deliberate. "Thriving? Do you have any idea how many qualified candidates have been rejected? Not because they weren't good enough, but because they didn't fit our image? This isn't about dismantling a system, Michael, it's about correcting a wrong." Megan sat silently, her gaze flicking between David and Michael as though caught in the crossfire of a heated battle. She could feel the weight of the discussion shift towards something far greater than herself. A debate about the values this company stood upon. "Mr. Miller," Megan finally spoke, her voice tentative, "I believed this position required a working style that aligned with the company's high pressure and competitive nature. I never intended to discriminate or make personal judgments." David leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Megan. "Working style? Or were you judging me based on something other than my qualifications and experience?" After placing a folder of notes on the table, David began recounting his experience during the interview with Megan. The room fell silent, and Megan's tension became visibly palpable. She attempted to defend herself. "Mr. Miller, I didn't think my questions during the interview would be so severely misinterpreted. My goal was simply to find the best fit for the role." David interrupted her, his tone sharper. "Misinterpreted? Megan, do you believe your questions were merely about finding the right fit?" David opened another folder from his briefcase, this time containing copies of internal emails. He quoted one email Megan had sent to a colleague just weeks earlier, which implied, "I don't believe candidates from less prestigious backgrounds can integrate well into our company. They'll struggle to impress high-profile clients." David picked up the printed document, locking eyes with Megan as he asked, "What do you make of these words? Do you still believe your actions were objective?" Megan faltered, her eyes darting quickly to the other executives in the room, silently seeking support. But no one spoke. David continued, this time producing a report containing feedback from employees, including direct complaints about Megan. One employee shared that she was rejected with the reasoning that she was not a cultural fit, despite having a resume that met every requirement. "What do you have to say about that?" Megan lowered her gaze, unable to find an answer. The clear evidence, drawn from her own words and actions, rendered any defense meaningless. David scanned the room, letting his words settle for a few moments before delivering his conclusion. "We're not talking about misunderstandings here, Megan. We're talking about a systemic issue, and silence or excuses will only make things worse." Megan appeared increasingly flustered, her voice trembling slightly as she attempted to explain. "What I meant was, we need people who can adapt quickly to high-pressure environments, people our clients can trust easily." David leaned forward, emphasizing every word in his response. "Are you saying I cannot adapt to a high-pressure environment? Or do you think Horizon Edge's clients wouldn't trust someone like me?" Megan lowered her head, her silence underscored by the sharp intensity of David's gaze and the quiet disapproval from everyone in the room. Her hands clenched tightly on the table as she took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. She sighed, her voice softer and more introspective as she began to speak. "Mr. Miller, I don't want to justify my actions, but I think you should know. I've been under significant pressure from previous leadership." She glanced around the room, her eyes searching for understanding from her colleagues, but she was met with unreadable expressions. She continued, "When I first took this position, I was told that every candidate had to be perfect in the eyes of our clients. Leadership at the time made it clear, we cannot let anyone jeopardize the company's image. That directive haunted me, and I started enforcing overly rigid, sometimes unfair, standards to ensure I didn't make any mistakes." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes reflected genuine emotion. "I didn't realize how many people I hurt in the process. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the company, but now I see I was perpetuating the same biases I once endured." Megan's admission cast a heavy silence over the room. Some of the executives lowered their heads, seemingly realizing that they, too, had played a part in the pressures she faced. David nodded slowly, his gaze still sharp but now tinged with a measure of empathy. "Megan, I understand the pressure you've been under, but that doesn't excuse the mistakes. Instead, let it be the motivation to change. If you're truly committed to making amends, this is your opportunity." Megan lowered her head once more, this time not out of shame but with a newfound determination taking root. "Megan," David continued, his voice growing firmer, "what you said during the interview wasn't about qualifications. It was about a prejudice you masked with vague language. This isn't just your issue, it's a reflection of a systemic problem we've allowed to persist for far too long." David's words were a condemnation, aimed not just at Megan, but at the entire company's recruitment culture. Megan sat silently, her hands still gripping the table, as she struggled to process the weight of the situation. David paused, letting the silence fill the room before pressing on. He knew this moment wasn't just about Megan, but about taking the first step toward dismantling an unjust system. Megan, now cornered by the truth, sat quietly, fully aware there was no escape from the accountability bearing down on her. As David continued to press Megan, Michael spoke up again, this time more defensively. "David, you're being unfair. Megan was simply doing what she thought was best for the company. Let's not forget, we're all under pressure to maintain our image with clients." David turned to Michael, his voice dropping but becoming even sharper. Pressure to maintain an image cannot justify rejecting talent and potential based on prejudice. If we continue this behavior, can you be certain our clients will support us when they learn the truth? Or are you just trying to protect your comfort? Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Linda, the operations head, who was typically measured in her statements, spoke up unexpectedly. "Michael, I have to agree with David. We've ignored these issues for too long. I've received similar feedback from my team, and I can't pretend that these problems don't exist. If we don't change, we'll lose both talent and credibility." The room fell silent. Linda's words, given her reputation for careful consideration, shifted the tone of the discussion. Michael leaned back, clearly unhappy, but choosing not to argue further. Megan glanced at Linda, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude, as if someone finally understood that she, too, was a product of a flawed system. The atmosphere in the boardroom was heavy, with everyone's eyes fixed on Megan. The silence stretched, pressing her to provide a clear explanation. Feeling the weight of the moment, Megan took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice steadier but still defensive, "I never intended to discriminate. My decision was entirely based on professional judgment. I believed the role required a specific working style, and I simply wanted to choose the best fit." David leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying every nuance of Megan's expression. Slowly shaking his head, he replied with a calm but cutting tone. "You call it professional judgment, but what I heard in the interview was anything but that. You questioned whether I would fit in with high-profile clients and whether my style would align with the team. These are not questions rooted in skills or experience, but in your subjective perceptions." Megan looked flustered, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for support from the other leaders. But every gaze she met was distant, even disappointed. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Susan Williams, a senior leader with over 15 years at Horizon Edge, broke the silence. "David, I understand your concerns, but I'd like to point out that the pressure Megan faces is not new. Since I started here, this system has always prioritized an ideal of perfection that, as you know, is nearly impossible to define. We need to question not just Megan's actions, but the entire process we've upheld for so long." Susan glanced at Megan, her expression a mix of reproach and sympathy. She understood the pressures Megan had endured, but also recognized that such behavior could no longer be excused. At the other end of the table, Mark Jensen, a younger leader and recent addition to the company, furrowed his brow and spoke up. "Honestly, I think placing the entire blame on Megan is unfair. If we want to change, we need to reevaluate how the whole system operates. Haven't we all, at some point, overlooked signs of bias during past recruitment discussions?" David's tone grew stronger as he continued. "If this were just a personal issue, I might accept that she made a mistake. But the truth is, I've gathered enough evidence to show that this is not an isolated case. Our recruitment system has allowed biases to fester, and our silence has only made the problem worse." He pulled out a list of employee feedback from his folder and placed it on the table, large enough for all the leaders to see. "These are statements from our employees about the recruitment process. They weren't rejected because they lacked qualifications, but because they didn't fit, a vague term often used to mask clear biases." Megan sat silently, her hands clenched tightly together. She opened her mouth as if to respond but couldn't find the right words. David looked directly at her, his gaze unyielding. "Ms. Carter, the truth is that you judged me not on what I could bring to the company but on what you assumed I couldn't. This is not just an act of injustice. It reflects a flawed hiring culture that we must change immediately." The room seemed frozen. Megan finally spoke, her voice low and far less confident than before. I didn't mean to do anything wrong, but if what I did was misunderstood." David interrupted, his tone cutting. "This is not a misunderstanding, Megan. This is a serious issue, and your failure to recognize that only highlights why we need to act now." The boardroom fell into a deep silence. Megan lowered her head, her gaze unfocused as she realized that none of the other leaders were siding with her. Every word David had spoken was not just an accusation, but a wake-up call aimed at an entire system that had allowed this issue to persist for far too long. Taking a deep breath, David let his gaze sweep across the room before concluding. "We cannot keep pretending everything is fine. Now is the time for us to change, not just with words, but with real action." The room fell into silence after David's resolute statement. Megan lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's gaze, while the other leaders sat tensely, waiting to see what would happen next. David stood, his determined gaze sweeping across the entire meeting room. He pulled a set of documents from his briefcase and placed them on the table, each movement deliberate, underscoring his seriousness. "We cannot continue to tolerate bias and injustice within our system," David began, his voice clear and weighted with authority. "And this isn't the responsibility of one individual. It's the responsibility of all of us." The leaders exchanged glances, realizing this was no longer a discussion. It was a declaration. David continued, "Today, I'm presenting a comprehensive reform plan for Horizon Edge's recruitment and promotion processes. These changes are not only intended to address the issues I have just witnessed, but to ensure we become the company we claim to be." As David outlined the reform steps, some leaders exchanged uneasy looks. Finally, Michael Green, the CFO, spoke up. "David, I understand what you're trying to achieve, but isn't this a bit extreme? Partnering with a third-party organization will incur significant costs, and I'm not sure all employees will agree with this approach." Lisa Tran, head of sales, added, "Not to mention, our clients may feel uneasy if they realize we're making major changes due to internal issues. Couldn't this harm the company's image?" David remained calm, meeting the skeptical looks head-on. His voice, though steady, carried an unyielding conviction. "I understand your concerns, but let me emphasize this. If we fail to act now, we won't just lose the trust of our employees. We'll lose the trust of our clients. Remember, transparency and fairness are what define Horizon Edge's values." The atmosphere grew heavier. Some leaders stayed silent, their reluctance evident in their expressions. However, David knew this was only the beginning of a long and challenging journey. He pointed to the document in front of him and methodically outlined the proposed reforms. 1. Bias elimination training. All employees, from senior management to new hires, will undergo mandatory training to identify and eliminate unconscious biases in recruitment and workplace interactions. 2. Third-party oversight. We will partner with an independent organization oversee the entire recruitment process, ensuring that every candidate is assessed fairly based on their actual qualifications. 3. Anonymous feedback system. An anonymous reporting system will be implemented, allowing employees to report unfair practices or discrimination without fear of retaliation. David's gaze moved deliberately across the room, locking eyes with each leader in turn, his expression firm yet resolute. These changes are not optional, they are mandatory. If we fail to act now, we not only betray the values this company stands for, but also risk losing the trust of our employees and clients alike. Some leaders nodded in agreement, while others picked up the document to examine it more closely, beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. David pressed further. Let us not forget, we are not just building a company. We are sending a message to the world about what we stand for, and that begins with holding ourselves accountable. His eyes landed on Megan, who remained silent, her hands clasped tightly on the table, too ashamed to look up. Though she said nothing, David's words were unmistakably directed at her and at all who had allowed the system to perpetuate unchecked. I trust that everyone here understands their responsibility in implementing these changes, David said firmly. We cannot afford to wait another day. The room was silent, but this time it was a silence born of understanding. The leaders began flipping through the documents, with no one opposing or deflecting the plan. David's reform strategy had charted a clear path forward, and no one dared question its urgency. David sat down, his expression unwavering, his voice steady as he concluded, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." David settled back into his chair, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Megan, who still sat with her head bowed and her hands clenched tightly on the table. The silence lingered, not a gentle silence, but a heavy one, as though everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for his next move. David drew a deep breath, then leaned forward, his voice clear and unyielding. "Ms. Carter, let me be direct. Your actions have not only impacted an individual, but have also eroded trust in the system we are striving to build. However, I also believe that everyone deserves a chance to rectify their mistakes." Megan raised her head, her eyes meeting David's. His words were not merely an accusation, but a challenge. David continued, his tone now deliberate and weighty. "You have two choices. The first option is to resign, walk away from the company and leave everything here. But if you choose to stay, the second option is to confront your mistakes head-on. You will undergo bias elimination training, listen to employee feedback, and, most importantly, work tirelessly to regain the trust that has been lost." The room collectively held its breath, all eyes fixed on Megan. This was not just a personal challenge for her, but a powerful message from David that Horizon Edge would no longer tolerate injustice in any form. Megan sat silently for a few moments that felt like an eternity. Finally, she took a deep breath, unclenched her hands, and lifted her head high. She met David's gaze directly, her voice trembling slightly but filled with sincerity. "I was wrong," Megan admitted, "and I want to make it right. I'll stay, attend every training, and do everything in my power to change. Not just myself, but to help rebuild the trust within the company." David studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes softening slightly. He nodded slowly before speaking, his tone deep and resonant. "Mistakes do not define us, Megan, but how we face them does. Your decision today is a start. However, regaining trust will require action, not just words." Megan nodded, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of determination. The other leaders in the room watched her with mixed expressions. But for the first time that day, Megan felt she was no longer alone. She understood that the road ahead would be arduous, but this decision was her only chance to atone for her mistakes. David turned his attention to the remaining leaders, his voice firm and resolute. Horizon Edge will change, and that change starts with us. This is the time to act, not just to speak. The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence was not of tension but of consensus. Megan lowered her head again, not in shame, but in determination. She knew that from this moment on, every eye would be on her, not to judge, but to see if she could deliver on her promise. Megan's decision to stay and work toward correcting her mistakes was only the first step in Horizon Edge's journey of transformation. The following morning, an official email from David Miller was sent to all employees announcing the company's comprehensive reform plan. In the message, David outlined the leadership's commitment to creating a fair, transparent environment where prejudice had no place. The announcement quickly garnered attention, not only within the company but also externally. Media outlets began publishing articles praising Horizon Edge's transparency and courage in addressing a sensitive issue that many other companies typically avoided. Headlines like Horizon Edge, a new standard for fair hiring, and Brave CEO confronts injustice within his own company appeared in major publications. The incident also drew the notice of competitors. Large firms in the industry, previously proud of their hiring processes, began reassessing their systems. They realized that if Horizon Edge could become the focus of criticism over bias, they too were vulnerable. A week after Horizon Edge's reform plan was announced, several major companies issued statements of their own, pledging to implement similar measures to ensure fairness in hiring and promotions. Training on unconscious bias and anonymous reporting systems began to emerge as industry standards rather than optional practices. Meanwhile, at Horizon Edge, real changes began to take shape. Megan Carter, determined to fulfill her promise, participated in training sessions and listened to candid feedback from her colleagues. She no longer avoided their gazes but faced them directly, eager to learn from her past mistakes. In a meeting with her team, Megan spoke with heartfelt sincerity. "I know my actions in the past caused harm and eroded trust, but I want you all to know that I am here to change, not just to improve myself, but to ensure that such issues never happen again." At first, her words were met with cautious responses, but over time her colleagues began to see genuine effort in Megan's actions. Trust, though difficult to rebuild, gradually started to return. The transformation at Horizon Edge extended beyond its internal operations. Major clients, initially skeptical of the company's commitment to ethical values, began to appreciate the efforts being made. Large contracts continued to be signed, and the company's revenue not only remained stable, but saw positive growth, bolstered by its strengthened public image. Horizon Edge's story became a valuable lesson in the industry, proving that acknowledging mistakes and committing to reform could benefit employees while building a stronger, more respected brand. From his office on the top floor, David Miller looked out over the city, feeling a sense of relief. He knew the journey of change was far from over, but the first steps had been taken, and their impact had already spread further than he had imagined. From his office on the top floor, David Miller sat quietly, gazing at the sprawling view of New York City before him. The lights from the towering skyscrapers shimmered like a reminder of the challenging yet meaningful journey he and Horizon Edge had just undertaken. He couldn't forget the moment he faced Megan Carter, the heavy silence in the boardroom, or the looks from the other leaders as they confronted truths they had ignored for years. Yet what gave him hope was that the first steps toward change had begun, not just within Horizon Edge, but across the entire industry. In the following week, Megan Carter participated in a mandatory bias elimination training session. It wasn't just a theoretical lecture, but an opportunity for her to hear stories from her colleagues, people who had once felt unfairly judged. Megan didn't shy away, but listened with genuine sincerity. However, Megan's journey of transformation was far from easy. She realized that many employees still kept their distance, even as she worked to demonstrate her sincerity through her actions. During a meeting, a colleague candidly told her, "I appreciate your effort to change, Megan, but it's hard to believe things can improve with just a few apologies." Those words cut deep into Megan's pride, but instead of reacting defensively, she responded with calm determination. "I understand, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I will continue to prove myself, not with words, but through actions." In a group discussion, Megan openly admitted, "I used to think I was doing the right thing for the company, but I was wrong. I let my personal biases affect my decisions, and I've realized that change cannot just be about words. I am committed to doing better." Her words began to carry weight, not because they were eloquent, but because her colleagues saw genuine change through her actions. Megan spent more time working directly with teams, ensuring that every candidate had a fair chance and starting to rebuild trust with employees who had lost faith in her. In a company-wide meeting, David delivered a powerful message. "We don't charge for appearances. We change for people, because every employee, candidate, and client deserves to be treated fairly. And remember, change doesn't start with the system. It starts with each of us." Those words didn't just resonate in the boardroom, they echoed across every level of the company. They became a guiding principle for a new Horizon Edge, where fairness and transparency were not just slogans, but core values. The story of Horizon Edge didn't close with a perfect ending, but with a hopeful beginning. The mistakes of the past were acknowledged, and the first steps to rectify them had been taken. David knew the road ahead would still be long, but he was proud that his company was becoming a role model, not just in the industry, but in how people treated one another. The story of Horizon Edge carries a profound lesson. True change begins with the courage to acknowledge mistakes, the commitment to rectify them, and the determination to build a better future for everyone. The journey of Horizon Edge is proof that change happens only when we are brave enough to face the truth and committed to action. What about you? If you were in David or Megan's position, what would you do to foster fairness in the workplace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, hit like and share to spread this message to more people. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.